Joining us today for the Paper Genocide panel is Dr. Jamie Mize. Dr. Mize is the Assistant Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. Her main focus is American Indian history. Her research focuses on Cherokee masculinity and how gender expectations inform Cherokee men's political decisions during an intense period of American colonialism in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Mize is currently working on a project that examines Cherokee masculinity from 1775 to 1846. This work explores how Cherokee men responded to the colonial pressures and how those responses were shaped by social and cultural expectations. She has taught courses on American Indian history, the history of global indigenous peoples, early modern American history, and 20th century world history. While she has taken on this research and her classes, she also is the director of REACH, Research, Engagement, Action, Community, and Humanities. This is a unique opportunity for Pembroke students to assist underrepresented minority students and interested in being a part of the world of academic in the future. We're so grateful for Dr. Mize to be a part of this panel. Thank you, Dr. Mize, for being a part of this panel.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
We're really excited that you're here too. The first question that I have for you, despite the introduction, what is your name, organization, and area of study?
I'm Dr. Jamie Mize. I am an assistant professor of history and American Indian Studies at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. Also REACH director, as you already mentioned, and my specialty area is the history of Southeastern Native people.
Okay, great. And that just leads us perfectly into the first question. What is paper genocide and how has it been enacted in North Carolina, as you know?
Okay, so paper genocide, essentially, all right, so most people know about Jim Crow, but oftentimes when people think about Jim Crow, they think about it very much in black and white terms. But in the South, particularly in states like North Carolina, where there were and continue to be large populations of Native people, Jim Crow impacted Native people as well, essentially by creating two categories, not of black and white, but of colored and white. And essentially a lot of the laws that we kind of associate or call Jim Crow laws that went on the books in southern states, but also states all across the country in the early 20th century, applied one drop rules. So if you had one drop of anything that wasn't considered white blood, then you were placed in a colored category. And so by enforcing these policies, particularly as women were giving birth and vital records like birth certificates and things like that are being created and recorded, Native people were oftentimes forced by these laws to just categorize themselves on these vital records as colored. And in so doing, were denied their right to identify themselves specifically as Native people. And so that whole concept, right, is something that we call paper genocide, because it's doing away with an entire group of people, but rather than doing it through a lot of the really violent means that we usually think about when we think about the term genocide, it's all done through paperwork by how these individuals are recorded on their vital records. And so for the state of North Carolina in particular, these laws were placed on the books beginning in 1923.
It's so vital to understand this because there are so many people who have been affected by this. And Annette Price, who will be in our panel next week live, will go over how this has affected her tribe. But moreover, how did paper genocide affect the people that were Native in the Southeast as a whole? What did it do to those people?
So, as I mentioned, it essentially deprived them of their ability to identify themselves as Native. The governments in those particular states didn't necessarily view them as Native, and that's had a tremendous legacy, right, in terms of the fact that it impacts some people's ability to identify as Native today. And so we tend, most of the things that we know really about paper genocide, or I would say the most solid documentary record that we have for it, is actually coming out of the state of Virginia. And I know you're going to talk about that, so I won't go into a tremendous amount of detail about it. But so North Carolina's law goes into effect in 1923. Virginia follows them in 1924. And I know you're going to talk about Walter Plecker later, but he's the one who writes all of these ideas for us that really are being applied across different states. But the problem, again, is so impactful in the state of North Carolina just because there was, and there continues to be, a very large indigenous population here. I mean, there are more indigenous people in the state of North Carolina than any other state east of the Mississippi.
Well, that just flows us perfectly into our next question, because what are the modern effects of paper genocide? You say that there are so many indigenous people who live in North Carolina, so there has to be a huge effect on them. And I'm sure it still affects them today. Could you expand more on that?
Sure. I mean, I've had a number of students who have come to me and told me the stories of their individual families about how a grandparent or something like that was forced to identify as colored. I will say, right, and in indigenous communities themselves, these were not issues, right? Because everybody knows who belongs and who doesn't belong, right? And so a Native identity is more than a racial category, right? It's not right for us to think about it strictly in those terms. It's a political identity. People are political members of sovereign nations, regardless of whether they're, state recognized, federally recognized, whatever. And so Native groups themselves, tribes or whatever, make up their own rules for the criteria that a person has to meet in order to be considered a citizen or a tribal member. And so in those cases, right, people aren't necessarily paying much attention to like what the state is saying in terms of how things are recorded on your vital record, because a lot of times it depends. These identities, these tribal identities, rely really heavily on being able to produce genealogies. And I'm speaking specifically here about most of the groups in North Carolina, right? Being able to trace your lineage to particular people. And so in that way, it didn't really affect them in terms of continuing to be recognized by their people as Native. But certainly it has a lot of implications if we think about like the bigger governments, right? It impacted people's ability to receive state recognition. You could say that a lot of these politics, a lot of these Jim Crow politics, of which paper genocide is a part of, continue to impact different groups' ability to get full federal recognition. And so those are some of the modern legacies that continue.
Annette Price, who we'll speak to next week, is currently going through that same issue. So it is in her tribe of the Wolf Creek, her husband's tribe. So it's really great that you bring that up because it's actually happening right now. But moving on to more focused on the symposium, our symposium is focused on the reproductive justice framework and the movement that goes along with it. Could you place the history and the legacy of paper genocide in a reproductive justice context?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in terms of, I mean, a lot of people think about reproductive justice in terms of, which is incorrect, and I'm sure you'll have people talk about this, but think about it strictly as just abortion, like somehow that's synonymous. And obviously, we all know that that's not correct. And so if we think about reproductive justice and the rights of a mother to properly identify their child on their birth certificate and connect them to their people, and we think about what the importance of that connection to people, like around here in Robinson County, the number one question you get asked all the time are, who's your people? I mean, that has significant consequences for reproductive justice. And again, mothers' rights to be able to, identify their children in a way that is appropriate and correct.
Being able to know your heritage and your genealogy and where you come from is a big part of raising a child, and having your own personal autonomy is who you are. So that makes perfect sense. So thank you so much for your contribution to this
Yeah,
panel,
my pleasure.
giving this knowledge to me and all of our people who are watching. And we look forward to hopefully speaking with you again in the future. Thank you, Dr. Mize.
Thank you.